de Medici.
Chapter 11. Interregnum.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Interregnum, 1494 to 1512. On the same day that Pietro and his family fled from Florence, Charles VIII entered Pisa and thereupon declared that city free from Florentine yoke. The Signoria sent an embassy, which included Savonarola, to the king to protest against this action as to Pisa, and to treat with him. But the only reply they could extract was, "Once in the great city, all shall be arranged." Savonarola had prophesied that a foreign invader should come to chastise the states of Italy for their profligate ways. The first of those states was now beginning to discover what forms such chastisement might take. The Republic, though they had exiled Pietro owing to his inability to prevent the French king's advance, found themselves as little able to do so as he had been, and 8 days afterwards Charles VIII entered Florence in the style of a victorious monarch entering a conquered city, while the Florentines found themselves required to accommodate in their midst an army of 20,000 men. And to have a medieval army of another nationality thus placed was a critical business. At any moment the smallest contretemps might produce an explosion and the plunder and sack of the city. It may be judged, therefore, with what pleasure the citizens of Florence saw this army march into their streets. As this was the first standing army ever seen by Europe, and as we know something of what standing armies have become during the intervening 400 years, it will be interesting to have a look at this first one, to stand, as it were, in the crowd at the Frediano Gate on that 17th November 1494, and watch this army as it passes into Florence. It consisted of 8,000 cavalry, the flower of the French chivalry, 5,000 Gascon infantry, 5,000 Swiss infantry, 4,000 Breton archers, 2,000 crossbowmen, and a strong train of artillery, the latter drawn for the first time by horses instead of oxen, a new thing in that age. The general appearance of these troops has been described for us by an old chronicler who evidently watched them closely that day, and gives a vivid description of this entry into Florence. He says, "The King of France entered the city at the Porta San Frediano, riding under a rich canopy borne by 4 knights, 2 on either side, and on each side of him rode his marshals. The royal bodyguard followed, consisting of 100 of the handsomest youths of France, and 200 knights of France on foot in splendid dresses. Then came the Swiss Guard with their brilliant uniforms of various colors, having halberds of burnished steel, their officers wearing rich plumes on their helmets. The center consisted of the Gascons, short, light, active men whose numbers seemed never-ending. After these came the cavalry, whose splendid appearance was admired by all, and in which there were to be found the most noble young men of France. They had engraved armor, mantles of richest brocade, banners of velvet embroidered with gold, chains of gold, and ornaments of gold. The cuirassiers presented a hideous appearance, with their horses looking like monsters from their ears and tails being cut quite short. Then came the archers, extraordinarily tall men from Scotland and other northern countries, and they looked more like wild beasts than men." Guicciardini, who was then a boy of 12, speaking of the whole procession, says that it was a spectacle in itself very grand, but one for which the spectators had small liking, by reason of the dread and terror with which it filled their minds. As regards Charles VIII himself, the incapable youth who wielded this formidable weapon, Guicciardini says that he was short, ugly, deformed, and altogether uneducated, and in all matters that he took in hand displayed an entire want of prudence and judgment, while Philippe de Comines says that he was weak, wilful, and surrounded by foolish counselors. Such was the youth at whose mercy Florence now lay. The army was quartered about the city on the unwilling inhabitants, and Charles proceeded to the despoiled and dismantled Medici palace, where he took up his abode. There, next day, he summoned the signoria before him to hear the humiliating terms which he intended to impose on the city. But the ancient spirit of Florence was as strong as ever, and when these terms were read out to them, the members of the signoria utterly refused to accept them. Whereupon the king flew into a rage and swore that if the treaty he had dictated were not forthwith signed, they should have war, that he would sound his trumpets, call out the troops, and sack the city. Upon this, one of the senators, Piero Capponi, gave that answer which passed into a Florentine proverb: "If you sound your trumpets, we will sound our bells." Charles knew what that meant, for he had on the day before seen a brief example of it in connection with a false alarm. He knew that it meant the ringing of the great bell, La Vacca, which hung in the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria, and which, when it sounded out over Florence, would call out into the streets the whole male population of the city, armed and ready to fall on the French troops scattered in the various quarters, and before they could offer any collective resistance. He would find himself in a hornet's nest. Charles reflected for a moment, and then, passing the matter off with a bad joke, gave in, and Florence was saved. A less humiliating treaty was drawn up and agreed to, though it was not a whit more satisfactory for Florence than that for agreeing to which Pietro the Unfortunate had incurred such a storm of indignation from the same men. Its chief articles were that Pisa and the fortresses of Sarzana, Sarzanello, Ripafratta, and Pietrasanta should remain in Charles's possession until the conquest of Naples was complete, and that Florence should pay him an indemnity of 120,000 ducats. And 2 days later, Charles marched his army out again and departed for Rome en route to Naples. On Charles's arrival before Rome, Pope Alexander VI took refuge in the castle of Sant'Angelo, but was induced to come forth and to give Caesar Borgia as a hostage. And after spending a month in Rome, Charles marched on towards Naples. Alfonso II, King of Naples, had no lack of courage or military ability. His bravery at the Battle of Otranto against the Turks had won him military renown. Nevertheless, he made no endeavor to defend his kingdom on this occasion. Fearing the strength of the French army, he fled to Sicily, and Charles VIII entered Naples on the 22nd February, 1495, as a conqueror. But while he spent his time there in triumphs and festivals, a formidable confederacy was formed to crush him, consisting of the Emperor Maximilian, Ferdinand, King of Aragon, the Pope, Venice, and even Ludovico Sforza, by whose invitation he had invaded Italy. Meanwhile, his army, wasted by its successes in Naples, was rapidly dwindling by disease. Charles saw no safety but in an immediate march back to France. Leaving part of his army in possession of Naples, he, in the beginning of June, started on his return march, proceeding by Rome and Siena, and hastening as much as possible. But the Allies assembled a force of 40,000 men to bar his way, awaiting him on the northern side of the Apennines. Owing to the losses by disease and the detachment left at Naples, Charles's army was reduced to 9,000 men. He reached Siena on the 18th June and Pontremoli on the 29th June. From there he crossed the Apennines by the pass of that name, an operation which took him 6 days. The battle which ensued was fought on the 6th July on the banks of the Taro at Fornovo, on the northern side of the Apennines. The French had the greatest difficulty in transporting their artillery over the mountains, and most of it arrived too late to take part in the battle, which, though very short, was the bloodiest that had taken place in Italy for 2 centuries. The Italians were entirely routed and lost 8,000 men, including their second-in-command, Rodolfo Gonzaga, uncle of the Marquis of Mantua. The French only lost, Comines says, about 100 men, but the Italian writers say 1,000. Charles showed much personal courage and much bad generalship. Nevertheless, the French army succeeded in driving their opponents off the field and continued their march towards Asti, though their long line of baggage, impeded by the difficulties of the mountains, for the most part fell a prey to the enemy, so that both sides claimed the victory. Charles reached Asti on the 15th July and remained there until October, when he returned to France. The King of Naples soon after regained Naples, and the sole results to Charles VIII of his expedition were the debts he had incurred to meet its expenses. The superior power possessed by the new engine in war, which was wielded by Charles VIII so inefficiently, was very clearly shown at Fornovo. At that battle the Allies had 40,000 men, Charles only 9,000. The latter fought under every disadvantage. They were weakened by disease, weary with long marches, insufficient food, and bad quarters, and had to fight as they emerged from the difficulties of a mountain pass, proverbially the position in which a force finds it hardest to bring up its full strength. On the other hand, their opponents were fresh and well cared for, and awaited the French on the banks of a river, the passage of which the latter had to force. Nevertheless, as the result of the attack which the French delivered, the Italian force suffered so severely that, though they still far outnumbered the French, no persuasion could make them rally and renew the fight. Charles's army, though less than a quarter the numerical strength of their foes, badly commanded, and fighting under every disadvantage, beat back their enemy, forced the passage of the Taro, broke through the cordon drawn between them and their objective, and continued their march, thus gaining the honor of the day, even though most of their baggage was plundered in their rear by the enemy. Fornovo was the first occasion on which a standing army was tested in battle, and the results showed very distinctly how much greater was its power than that of the kind of troops hitherto employed. This expedition of Charles VIII into Italy, though it was so barren of immediate results, had great ultimate consequences, and was a turning point in the history of Europe. Michelet says that it was no less than the revelation of Italy to the nations of the North. It ushered in that new era already mentioned, in which the northern nations were to oust the Italian states from the foremost place in the politics of Europe, a process which was accompanied by a state of almost constant war in Italy. During the 18 years that followed, Florence sternly kept the Medici out of her territories, and foiled all schemes for their return. It was made death to be found guilty of attempting to restore that family, and in 1497 old Bernardo de Nero, who was 72 years of age and had been 3 times gonfaloniere, being found guilty of this offense, was beheaded. This period, 1494 to 1512, which in a history relating to the Medici power in Florence it is convenient to call the Interregnum, and which covers the pontificates of Popes Alexander VI and Julius II, was an eventful one in the history of Italy and of Europe. But Florence, her destinies no longer swayed by the family which had known how to make their country strong and powerful, took an altogether insignificant part in these events, more so than any other state in Italy. While the struggle of contending nations was taking place all round her, she was entirely occupied in ignoble turmoils over domestic politics. She suffered severely in consequence, having to endure heavy taxation in order to pay subsidies now to one and now to another of the combatants, and only just missed being captured by Caesar Borgia, before whom she had most ignominiously to humble herself. So far, therefore, as Florence is concerned, the record of this period consists of little else than internal discord and misgovernment, unceasing turmoils between rival factions, fresh constitutions formed every few months, an administration utterly corrupt, a total decline in political influence abroad, and anarchy, injustice, and misery at home are the prevailing features of this period. And nothing could better have vindicated the rule which the Medici had exercised than the state of things which supervened when it was withdrawn. Some have contrived even here to found a charge against the family, declaring this due to their having enervated the Florentines. It was, however, simply the reversion to those conditions which had obtained before the Medici arose, and which reappeared upon the removal of the only power which had ever been able to keep Florence free from such conflicts. During the first 4 years of the above period, 1494 to 1498, the chief influence in the state was exercised by Savonarola. Upon the departure of Charles VIII, one change after another in the form of government took place, accompanied by constant disturbances, until at length an end to these was put for a time by Savonarola, who, in accordance with the cry of the people for a constitution on the lines of that of Venice, formed the Grand Council, comprising every citizen of 29 years of age, who, or whose father, grandfather, or great-grandfather had held one of the higher magistracies. The number of members was limited to 1,000, with a change of members every 6 months. Savonarola also made strenuous efforts to put down the luxury and profligacy to which the Florentines had become addicted, and for a while he succeeded. The extraordinary movement which he brought about is without a parallel. Florence for a time put on a Puritan garb, and the effect manifested itself in many differently minded men. Baccio della Porta became a monk in the monastery of San Marco, taking the name Fra Bartolomeo. 2 of the Della Robbia family became priests. Lorenzo di Credi spent the rest of his life in the monastery of Santa Maria Novella. Botticelli became an ardent disciple of Savonarola, and would paint only pictures inspired by his sermons. Cronaca, the celebrated storyteller, would talk only of Savonarola. Michelangelo, to the end of his life, retained a vivid remembrance of the powerful voice and impassioned gestures of the great preacher, and pondered over his sermons in his old age. Among the many notable scenes which the Piazza della Signoria has witnessed, none is more remarkable than the strange bonfire for the destruction of the worldly allurements, the Vanities, which took place in 1497, at the time of the Carnival, in the midst of a concourse of the entire city. Harford, in his Life of Michelangelo, says, "A pyramidal scaffold was erected opposite the palace of the Signoria. At its base were to be seen false hair, false beards, masquerading dresses, rouge pots, cards and dice, mirrors and perfumery, beads and trinkets of various sorts. Higher up were arranged books and drawings, busts and portraits of the most celebrated Florentine beauties. Even Fra Bartolomeo was so carried away by the enthusiasm as to bring his Life Academy studies. Lorenzo di Credi, another devoted follower of Savonarola, did the same. The Signoria looked on from a balcony. Guards were stationed to prevent unholy thefts. And as the fire rose, there was a burst of chants and the singing of the Te Deum to the sound of trumpets and the clanging of bells. But eventually the people got tired of a life bereft of their favorite vanities, and about the same time Savonarola's preaching, which had hitherto concerned itself with the errors of Florence, began to thunder against the far greater iniquities of Rome, and to urge for a reformation of the Church. And it was indeed high time for such a reformation, for the state of things at Rome was arousing universal indignation. Alexander VI, Roderigo Borgia, who was pope from 1492 to 1508, has been styled by Mosheim the Nero among popes, and the conjunction in him of shameless greed, perfidy, cruelty, and licentiousness brought the papacy to the lowest moral depth it had touched since the dark age of the 10th century. His politics were governed solely by one consideration, that of acquiring, by whatever means, as many of the minor states as possible, in order to form a sovereignty for his son, Caesar Borgia, called by Ranke a virtuoso in crime. Such being the character of the Pope at the time, an earnest reformer like Savonarola could scarcely fail to give voice to what was becoming the sentiments of all Europe regarding the papal court. His sermons began to denounce its iniquities and to press for a general council to reform the Church. Neither Alexander VI nor Caesar Borgia had the smallest intention of suffering the fate which had overtaken Pope John XXIII 80 years before, and one such sermon delivered in Rome would have promptly ended Savonarola's life. But in Florence he could not be so easily got at. The Pope did his utmost to silence him and to get him into his power, but for some time unsuccessfully, he being too popular with the Florentines. But Florence no longer had the strong government and united people which she had possessed when she hung an archbishop and defied a pope who attempted to stir up strife within her walls. Her condition now was just the reverse, and in a city torn by so many factions, and with a government become both weak and corrupt, it was easy to create a party hostile to the stern preacher of reform and ready to perform the Pope's work. So that at length, in 1498, Alexander VI was able to send emissaries to Florence, who soon persuaded the Signoria to act as his agents in a crime which has brought permanent infamy both on the Pope who ordered it and on the government which carried it out. Meanwhile, Savonarola had written letters to various sovereigns, pressing them to assemble a general council, so that the Pope was more anxious than ever to have him put out of life with all speed. It was unfortunate for Savonarola that just at this juncture Charles VIII, on whom he chiefly relied, though it was reliance on a broken reed, was on the 5th April 1498 accidentally killed at the castle of Amboise by striking his head against the top of a low doorway. He was succeeded by his distant cousin, Louis XII. On the 7th April, a challenge by the rival community of the Franciscans to an ordeal by fire, to which Savonarola weakly agreed, and for which elaborate preparations were made, though the Signoria never intended it to be carried out, served the purpose of destroying his popularity with the people, who were furious when at the last moment the ordeal was vetoed. Accordingly, on the 9th April, Savonarola received a summons from the Signoria to surrender himself into their hands. The friars of San Marco refused to allow him to be taken from them to what all knew meant torture and death, and the church and monastery were furiously attacked by the troops of the Signoria during a whole day and bravely defended. In the evening, however, on the troops forcing their way into the church, Savonarola refused to allow further bloodshed, and, after taking a sorrowful farewell of the brethren, surrendered himself to the troops. He was taken to the Palazzo della Signoria, imprisoned in the cell called the Alberghettino, and day after day subjected to torture, the Pope sending frequent messages to the Signoria to wring something from him which might serve as a ground for putting him to death. Nevertheless, this was a difficult task, one, however, to which those who wished to stand well with the Pope turned all their evil ingenuity, with the result that the so-called trial became a mockery of justice. Seldom has there been a blacker page in the proceedings of any government than that relating to Savonarola's trial and condemnation. The criminal court by which in the ordinary course he should have been tried, the Eight, not being supposed to be sufficiently hostile to him, had new members appointed to it, though the period of office of their predecessors had not expired. When, however, it became apparent that even this would not suffice to attain the desired result, a special court was constituted, composed of 17 commissioners, all of them Savonarola's avowed enemies. Even one of these, Bartolo Zatti, when he learned the nature of the work expected of him, refused to serve, declaring that he would take no part in a murder. Savonarola was subjected to successive trials, and during these, for a period of about 16 days, was tortured daily. Once he was placed on the rack 14 times in a single day. Nevertheless, nothing could be proved against him or wrung from him which his judges could twist into an admission of either treason or heresy. So his enemies had to resort to forgery. A miscreant named Cercecone, a notary who had said to one of the judges, "If no case exists, one must be invented," was employed to take down the victim's replies while under torture. And this change in the arrangements produced the required results. In refutation of the supposition that on this last occasion Savonarola falsified his previous replies, Mr. Hyatt says as follows. On the 19th April, a document purporting to be a report of Savonarola's replies to the examiners was signed by him. It is probable that his signature was obtained by a trick, but be this as it may, it is certain that the signed deposition had been falsified, or, as one of the judges euphemistically put it, for a good purpose somewhat had been omitted from and somewhat added to it. On the strength of this garbled report, many writers have said that he broke down under torture, and even Professor Villari gives a reluctant assent to this view and offers an elaborate apology for his hero. But as evidence against Savonarola, the document is not worth the paper it was written on. It is in part admittedly fictitious, and which part of it are additions and which alterations, and what has been omitted, it is impossible to discover. Everything tends to show that Savonarola, in spite of his physical infirmities, displayed on the rack heroic fortitude. On the 19th May, the papal commissioners charged with the final proceedings arrived in Florence. Nardi states that their instructions were to put Savonarola to death were he even another Saint John the Baptist. On 20th May and the 2 following days, Savonarola underwent before them his third mock trial, being examined under worse torture than ever. The results of this final examination were never signed or made public, the trial being thus practically left unfinished. Nothing had been elicited from him proving his guilt of heresy or crime. Nevertheless, on the evening of the 22nd May, after many days of torture, after every kind of fraud and injustice had been put in force, and as the result of a so-called trial not even legally completed, Savonarola, whose only crime was his denunciation of the vices of the Borgian papacy and his appeals for its reformation, was condemned to death. And also the other two friars of San Marco, who had been tried with him, Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro. On the following morning, 23rd May, 1498, the three companions were brought out of the Palazzo della Signoria onto the Ringhiera, and after being subjected to various insults, were conducted to the scaffold. And on the very spot where the bonfire of the Vanities had taken place, the reformer who had a short time before been worshipped by Florence was hanged and burnt in the presence of the whole city. Thus did Florence show before the eyes of Europe what the rule of the Medici had been to her. Such a crime as the above would have been as impossible under the rule of Lorenzo the Magnificent as under any government of the present day. In this episode we seem to see a totally different Florence from that of 20 years before, and instead of a united people, strong in their sense of justice, defying a pope even though he was backed by numerous allies, we see a divided people and a corrupt and subservient government, ready at a pope's command to set at naught every principle of justice and to employ methods from which every honest Florentine revolted. The defiance of all law, the disgraceful frauds, the corruptibility of the judges, and the faction fighting through which alone the Pope was able to achieve his object, all showed how greatly Florence had in only 4 years deteriorated through the loss of that rule under which she had during the previous 60 years made herself great and respected. The crime of Savonarola's judicial murder is the strongest possible vindication of the rule which had been established by the Medici. That movement, which exercised a permanent influence on so many others, had its effect also on Botticelli. The entire change in the mental atmosphere of Florence wrought by Savonarola during the years 1494 to 1498 caused a no less radical change in the character of Botticelli's pictures, so that we have now a third period in his painting. Just as Cronaca could talk only of Savonarola, so could Botticelli now paint only pictures which repeated the impassioned sermons of Florence's great preacher. Henceforth we have no more pictures from him of graceful Greek goddesses and classic myths, but picture after picture on the one subject of the Blessed Virgin and Child. The same train of thought runs through them all. No longer does Botticelli paint her in all the joy of the Magnificat. It is now the sorrow of the Madre Dolorosa that is set before us, and with every variety of illustration. And in this too there is a distinction. It is not as the sorrowing mother beneath the cross that she is depicted, but as the young mother with the ever-present sword of foreboding sorrow piercing her heart with the knowledge of that which was to come, of which others around her were ignorant, and in which therefore they could afford her no sympathy. Sometimes it is the mother alone who feels this foreboding sorrow. Sometimes it permeates both mother and child, but whether in her alone or in both, this is always the prevailing thought. Speaking of these pictures, Steinmann says, "A presentiment of coming woe seems to cast its shadow on the Virgin's soul. She embraces the child with a half-repressed fervor of passionate love, but all the time the shadow of an underlying sorrow makes the flame of joy burn dimly." All this is in accord with Savonarola's sermons, and here we see painting able to bring to our minds the words of a preacher dead 400 years ago. In doing this, Botticelli introduces many touching details by which to bring his point home to those to whom he speaks. As examples, the following may be taken. The Madonna of the Pomegranate. This picture, in its original frame, hangs in the Tuscan room of the Uffizi Gallery. The child Christ holds in his left hand a bitten pomegranate, and looking with a sad expression straight at the beholder, holds up his right hand in blessing. Steinmann says, "In this picture both child and mother are more than ever conscious of bearing the burden of all the sorrow of mankind." He considers this to be Botticelli's best picture. Hanging as it does opposite the Madonna of the Magnificat, the two are well placed for comparison, the one painted in Botticelli's earliest years, the other not less than 30 years afterwards. The keynote of the one, humility, of the other, foreboding sorrow. The Madonna and Child in the Brera Gallery, Milan. In this case the child is sitting on the Virgin's knee and is playing with a rough wreath of thorns and 3 nails, and looking up at her in wonderment at her sadness. The Madonna and Child in the National Gallery, London. The Virgin embraces the child, who stands on her lap. He looks in her face, seeking the cause of her sorrow, while her face and attitude express a deep tenderness, penetrated as usual with a profound sadness. This picture has been a good deal damaged in its travels, but the damage has spared the face of the Child Christ, which is particularly beautiful. The Madonna of St. Barnabas, painted for the convent of St. Barnabas, and now in the Accademia delle Belle Arti, Florence. This picture has suffered, through damage and removal and attempted restoration, as regards the face of the Child Christ, which has been quite spoiled. But the rest of the painting is beautiful, and it is one of Botticelli's most admired works. 2 angels stand on either side of the Madonna and Child, one holding up before her a crown of thorns, and the other 3 nails, while 2 more angels hold back the curtains of the throne. The Virgin looks straight out before her with a sweet, sad expression. 6 saints stand before the throne, representing 6 different types of mankind. Saint Michael, manly strength and beauty. Saint John the Baptist, asceticism. Saint Ambrose, the strong, practical bishop. Saint Augustine, theological learning. Saint Barnabas, unselfish devotion to the consolation of the miserable and oppressed. And Saint Catherine, womanly feeling. Steinmann, remarking on this picture, says, "It would seem as if Dante's wonderful characterization of the Virgin struck the keynote of the whole picture, viz. his words, umile ed alta più che creatura, humble and high beyond all other created being. Sitting on her throne under the velvet canopy, affectionately served by angels, venerated by saints, she yet can feel no joy. She gazes straight out before her, with a sad, far-away expression in her eyes, humble and high in truth, yet sighing under the weight of her destiny, and with the sword already piercing her heart." In one other point, noticeable in all these pictures, Botticelli differs markedly from the artists who were to follow in the next generation, led by Michelangelo. Botticelli forces our whole attention on the subject, not on the painter. In looking at them, it is not of Botticelli that we think. As Steinmann says, "There was never a painter who so entirely forgot himself in his subject. And in these pictures he has concentrated his whole thoughts on the character of the Madonna. And there has been none since his day who was so unwearied in inventing new modes of treatment, which would both bring the Virgin and Child into human closeness to the beholder, and at the same time arouse his awe and veneration." But a time came when, instead of Florence being swayed by Savonarola's sermons, it condemned him and put him to death. And for those who revered him, the only feeling left was horror, both at the crime itself and at the reign of anarchy and vice that succeeded it. And so now again we have a complete change in Botticelli's pictures, caused by the change in the circumstances around him, and have the pictures of his 4th and last period. In this there are, besides the sketches illustrating Dante's poem, only 2 pictures, but they are notable ones, viz. 1. Calumny, now in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence, its general idea taken from Lucian's account of a picture on that subject by the Greek painter Apelles, and 2. The Nativity, now in the National Gallery, London. The drawings illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy were executed at various times between 1492 and 1497, but were left unfinished, Botticelli, the ardent partisan of Savonarola, being thenceforth entirely engrossed with the tragedy of the latter's end. The celebrated picture of Calumny is thus described. The scene is laid in a stately judgment hall in the classic style, on the decoration of which every resource of art has been expended. Between its lofty arches there is a distant view of a calm sea. Life-sized marble figures stand in the niches of the pillars of the hall, like figures outside Or San Michele, and every vacant space is adorned with richly gilded sculpture. It is a magnificent Renaissance building which fancy imagines a place in which wisdom and justice alone would exist, a place of refuge in which poets and thinkers may prepare new intellectual achievements as they walk in the stately portico by the sea. Instead of this, we witness a fearful deed of violence. In bitter contrast with the splendid marble all round, in ironical mockery of the solemn statues of justice and virtue on the walls, a noisy throng is dragging the innocent victim of calumny before the tribunal of the unjust judge who sits with crown and scepter on a richly decorated throne. Two female figures, Ignorance and Suspicion, whisper in the long ass's ears of the unjust judge, while in front of him Envy declaims with imperious force. With his right hand Envy leads on Calumny, who holds a burning torch before her as a treacherous symbol of her pretended love of truth. She dashes impetuously forward, with her left hand grasping mercilessly the hair of her victim, who lies on the ground stripped naked, with his folded hands raised to heaven in assertion of his innocence. Calumny's appearance is plausible and crafty. Her clothing is costly, and her two attendants, Fraud and Deception, are busy twining fresh roses in her golden hair. Behind these, as what follows from Injustice and Cruelty, comes the tormentor, Remorse, a hideous hag clothed from head to foot in ragged mourning attire, who, clasping her trembling hands before her, turns her face round over her shoulder to look at the figure behind her of naked Truth, a slim female figure recalling Botticelli's Venus, who gazes upwards and lifts her right hand to heaven in adjuration against the scene of injustice, cruelty, and wrong. Now, what does all this mean? At first sight, this picture repels us by its strange scene of grotesque violence. But it has its meaning in the history of the time. For in this picture, Botticelli writes for those who may come after the story of how Savonarola was done to death. In the stately Renaissance hall, the refuge for poets and philosophers, with its solemn statues of wisdom and justice, and its profuse decoration by art, Botticelli represents Florence as for 60 years it had been. In the unjust judge, with his ass's ears, seated on a throne with crown and scepter which he is not fit to bear, and in the scene of violence enacted in front of him, the painter represents the government of Florence as it had become, still occupying the localities where such different sentiments had once prevailed. In the figures of Ignorance and Suspicion, Envy and Calumny, Fraud and Deception, he represents the motives and the methods which had prevailed to put to death their victim Savonarola, while the figures of Remorse and Truth embody Botticelli's prophecy of what shall afterwards follow. This picture was painted by Botticelli for his friend Antonio Segni in the year 1498 or 1499, and it is stated that it was not allowed to be seen by the public eye until after Botticelli's death. If so, this would help to confirm the above theory as to its meaning. It is, of course, deeply interesting, both on account of the great preacher himself, and also as the powerful record given by one then living as to the way in which Savonarola's life was taken, and how false were the lies which then, and for many years afterwards, were sedulously promulgated regarding the self-accusations declared to have been made by him under torture. And then we have another strange picture, the Nativity, painted at the end of the year 1500, Botticelli's last picture, now in the National Gallery, London. And this again refers to Savonarola, and to the state of things in Florence after his death. In an inscription written over it in Greek, Botticelli explains its meaning thus: "This picture I, Alessandro, painted at the end of the year 1500 in the troubles of Italy, in the half-time after the time, during the fulfillment of the 11th of St. John, in the second woe of the Apocalypse, in the loosing of the devil for 3 years and a half. Afterwards he shall be chained according to the 12th of St. John, and we shall see him trodden down as in this picture." In the center is the usual group of the Nativity, while right and left kneel the Magi and the shepherds, with angel pointing out to them the miracle. On the penthouse roof and in the sky, angels sing the Gloria in excelsis, and dance hand in hand, swinging olive boughs and crowns in their joy. In the foreground, devils crawl away to hide in the rocks, while rejoicing angels fall on the necks of Savonarola and his 2 companions, the witnesses slain for the word of their testimony. The picture not only shows how deeply rooted was the memory of Savonarola in Botticelli's mind, but also it and its inscription testify to what was the condition of crime and vice which ran riot in Florence in these years, when Cambi tells us that citizens who sought redress in the law courts were frequently stabbed in the street the next night, judges pronounced iniquitous sentences, and there was no reverence for holy things or fear of shame. After this date Botticelli became too infirm to paint. He died in 1510 at the age of 64, and was buried in his father's vault in his parish church of Ognissanti. Footnote: Botticelli was buried with extreme secrecy, probably because he was a noted partisan of Savonarola, and his tomb still remains without any tombstone. End of footnote. Although Perugino belongs to Perugia, he painted for so many years in Florence, where all his best work was done, that he is always classed with the Tuscan school. When he died in 1524, he was almost the last of that great school which had given to painting its rebirth and had led the way in that art for over 200 years. Footnote: Lorenzo di Credi and Andrea del Sarto were the only 2 first-class painters of the Tuscan school who survived him, Andrea del Sarto by 7 years and Lorenzo di Credi by 13 years. End of footnote. Ruskin considers Perugino the culminating point of the Tuscan school of painting. Having spent 3 years in Florence as the pupil of Verrocchio, 1479 to 1482, and having executed various works there in the years 1486 to 1491, Perugino in 1492 set up his studio in that city. Ruskin says, "It is from this time that we date the great series of pictures in which he seems to carry to their deepest depth the expression of devotion, of self-sacrifice, and of holy grief." Perugino painted regularly in Florence from 1492 to 1498, and again during the greater part of the years 1501 to 1510, after which date he did little notable work, so that all his best work was done during this period of the Interregnum. As all know, he was Raphael's master, and he survived his great pupil by 4 years. Perugino has 4 chief characteristics. First, free open space, regarding which Mr. Bernhard Berenson says, "Space composition is not an arrangement to be judged as extending only laterally or up and down on a flat surface, but as extending inward in depth as well. It is composition in 3 dimensions and not in 2, in the cube and not merely on the surface." In this space composition, Perugino excelled all either before or after him. By regular gradations, his distances recede far into the background, giving a feeling of vast and limitless space. Second, aloofness in his figures. Dr. Williamson says, "They stand apart from one another, connected by a thread of thought with each other, and with the central feature of the picture, but each of them in every other way self-contained." Third, his beautiful landscapes, with distant hills bathed in a blue mist, revealing long stretches of fertile land on either side, with single trees silhouetted against the sky, and all bathed in pale golden sunlight. Fourth, a severe absence of strong action or excited emotion. Convulsive action was as much an offense to him as was its absence in his works an offense to Michelangelo. The joint effect of these 4 characteristics is to produce pictures breathing a wonderful peace. Regarding the entombment, now in the Pitti Gallery, Dr. Williamson says, "In this picture, space composition is seen in its full vigor. How vast is the space in which the episode is placed, and how wonderful the sense of immeasurable distance produced! How quiet is the atmosphere of the scene! How reverent and tender a mood it creates! The picture is one of the best Perugino ever painted. Each figure is distinct, self-centered, and enfolded in its own grief. It is a picture full of sentiment, yet sober and thoughtful." And regarding his baptism of Christ, now at Rouen, the same writer says, "Around the 2 central figures are kneeling angels and attendant figures, 8 only in number, carefully graduated in size according to position, aloof, serious, and still. Away and away beyond is the rolling landscape with its exquisite hills and dainty detached trees standing out clear against the sky. On and on the eye travels, seeking to reach the limits of this limitless vision, and impressed more and more by the skill that painted in so tiny a compass so vast a scene." Of Perugino's masterpiece, his fresco of the Crucifixion, painted in the chapter house of the convent of Santa Maria Maddalena de' Pazzi in Florence, it has been very generally felt that it is the most perfect representation of the Crucifixion ever achieved by any painter, while the whole picture breathes an indescribable spirit of peace. After Savonarola's death, Florence became more than ever a prey to anarchy. 3 different factions, the Ottimati, the Bigi, and the Frateschi, contended unceasingly, and frequent changes in the constitution only produced increased strife. At length, after 3 years of turmoil, the citizens were driven to a measure which stultified all their action in abolishing the rule of the Medici. They resolved that the only remedy for the evils of the city was the appointment of a gonfaloniere for life, as a sort of permanent dictator. There were various candidates, but as might have been expected under the conditions which prevailed, instead of a strong man being elected, the majority of the votes were given to a weak one, whom no party had any reason to fear. Piero Soderini, a well-meaning and generally respected man with no strength or ability, was elected, and he remained permanently gonfaloniere during the rest of the period of the Interregnum, though, owing to his weakness and incapacity, this brought little amelioration of the evils under which Florence groaned. The legal tribunals were utterly corrupt. Crime of every kind was rife. Men of ability kept aloof from public affairs. The Great Council refused to vote money necessary to meet the financial engagements of the state. disputes and riots were incessant, and all writers give deplorable accounts of the conditions of the city. Camby says, "Justice no longer existed among the citizens through fear of each other." And Guicciardini remarks, "It is difficult to imagine a city so thoroughly shattered and ill-regulated as ours was at this time." This condition of things in Florence naturally caused her to sink into a position of insignificance among the states of Italy. Her foreign affairs were unceasingly mismanaged, being in the hands of men who were without any talents for such a task. Yet it was a time when a capable direction of foreign affairs was above all necessary. After Charles VIII's expedition, Pope Alexander VI brought about a league between Rome, Venice, Milan, the Emperor Maximilian, and Henry VII of England against France, a league which threatened the very existence of the French monarchy and of those states, such as Ferrara, Florence, and Bologna, which clung to the French alliance. Louis XII, on succeeding to the French throne in 1498, set himself to break up this league, and the campaigns which during the next 14 years he carried on in succession against Milan, Naples, Venice, and the Pope kept Italy in a state of permanent warfare and threw all states there into confusion. In 1499, Louis XII sent against Milan an army which drove out Il Moro, who fled to Innsbruck to the protection of the Emperor Maximilian. The latter, in this year, married his eldest son, the Archduke Philip, to Joanna, the eldest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a marriage which had important consequences in the next generation. In the same year, Florence put to death the only man she possessed who had the talents of a general, Paolo Vitelli. The Republic had sent him with a force to retake Pisa, which Charles VIII had never restored, but the attempt failed, and Vitelli was accused of treachery, recalled, and executed, though it is stated by Guicciardini that he was innocent. In 1500 Il Moro regained Milan, but was soon afterwards captured by the French and carried off to France, where he was imprisoned in the castle of Loches for the remaining 8 years of his life, Louis XII taking possession of Milan. In the same year, the combined forces of Spain and France conquered Naples, but this was followed by a dispute over its possession, which brought on a 3 years' war between them. Nor did central Italy fare any better than the north and south. In the endeavor to establish a sovereignty of central Italy, Caesar Borgia was seizing state after state, thus gaining in succession Imola, Forlì, Urbino, Faenza, Pesaro, Rimini, and Piombino, and making himself the terror of Romagna. In 1501, Caesar Borgia, having gained Faenza by causing its ruler, the young Astorre Manfredi, to be murdered, advanced into the Val d'Arno and threatened Florence. The Signoria ignominiously bought him off by agreeing to appoint him Captain General of Florence's forces at a fixed salary of 36,000 florins a year. In the same year, Alexander VI, in order to detach Ferrara from the French king, succeeded in bringing about a marriage between his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, and Alfonso, the eldest son of the Duke of Ferrara. In 1502, Caesar Borgia, who, as the result of various crimes, had now become Duke of Valentino, Duke of Urbino, Duke of Romagna, Prince of Andria, and Lord of Piombino, informed Florence that her government did not please him, and that she had better amend it. The Signoria, relying on Louis XII's approaching return to Italy, ordered its envoys to temporize, and other events called off Caesar Borgia for a time from attacking Florence. He, however, informed her government significantly that the French king would not be always in Italy. In 1508, Louis XII advanced again into Italy to prosecute his war with Spain for the possession of Naples, but the campaign turned out adversely for the French. This would undoubtedly have brought Caesar Borgia again upon Florence, but just at this juncture Pope Alexander VI suddenly died, Caesar Borgia being at the same time taken dangerously ill. Caesar Borgia after some time recovered, but only to find all his power broken through the death of the Pope. The very states which he had usurped at once reverted to their original rulers, and Caesar Borgia was eventually arrested by the commander of the Spanish forces in southern Italy, Gonsalvo, and sent as a prisoner to Spain, where 4 years later he was killed while fighting for the King of Navarre. In December 1508, the French army in southern Italy sustained a crushing defeat at a battle which took place on the river Garigliano. It managed to retreat in great disorder to Gaeta, but was there forced to capitulate and to agree to return to France. This brought the 3 years' war in southern Italy between France and Spain to an end, and Naples and Sicily were annexed by Ferdinand of Spain to the Spanish crown and placed in charge of a viceroy. It was in the above battle that Pietro the Unfortunate lost his life, whereby his next brother, Cardinal Giovanni, became head of the Medici family. Pope Alexander VI was succeeded by Pius III, but he died 1 month later, and was succeeded by Julius II, Giuliano della Rovere, the celebrated fighting pope, the destroyer of the old St. Peter's, the founder of the new St. Peter's, and the friend and antagonist of Michelangelo. A strong character with many good points, he was fonder of war than of anything else, and was perpetually in the field commanding his forces in person. Italy had now become the battlefield on which France, Spain, and Germany fought perpetually for supremacy, and this strong, fiery old man seized with avidity the opportunity this state of things gave him to indulge his predilection for war. Footnote: his portrait by Raphael hangs in the Uffizi Gallery and is thoroughly characteristic. There is a replica of it also in the Pitti Gallery and another in the National Gallery, London. End of footnote. From 1503 to 1507, Julius II was chiefly occupied in subduing in succession the various states of Romagna, and forming them into the states of the Church, which he now founded, and which thenceforth remains permanently the temporal dominion of the papacy. In 1508 he turned his arms against Venice, and formed the League of Cambrai, a league entered into by Louis XII, the Emperor Maximilian, Ferdinand of Spain, and himself, to crush the power of Venice and for partition of her inland dominions. Meanwhile, the fortunes of the Medici family were beginning to emerge from the gloom in which for 10 years they had been plunged. On Julius II becoming pope in 1503, and Giovanni, a man whose good-natured and peaceable disposition had always been contrasted with that of his elder brother, becoming in the same year the head of the family, many who had before looked on the Medici with disfavor became ready to help them, including Pope Julius himself. Nor was the same effect unfelt even in Florence. It was Pietro and his wife who were so specially obnoxious to the Florentines, not the Medici family as a whole. And as time went on, and the effects of the misrule in Florence became more and more intolerable, the number of the citizens who secretly desired the return of this family, now that it was represented by two such characters as Giovanni and his brother Giuliano, grew constantly greater, though none dared to acknowledge this desire, owing to the law which made it death to urge the return of the Medici. Giovanni's behavior and manner of life in Rome was such as to encourage these sentiments. He showed no disposition to interfere in the affairs of the Florentines, though under the incapable rule of Piero Soderini they continued in their chronic state of discord and anarchy. He lived plainly, having in fact but little means for ostentation, and often finding it hard to keep out of debt, never desponding, always cheerful, animated, and agreeable in his manners to all, and taking great interest in all matters connected with art and literature, though he had little money himself to spend upon such things. By this course of conduct, and by the qualities of his character, which made friends where Pietro only made enemies, Giovanni gradually retrieved the downfall of his family, creating a feeling in their favor both outside and inside Florence, which led a few years later to their being reinstalled in power there. The whole family, including Pietro's widow Alfonsina, with their two children, Lorenzo and Clarice, were now living in Rome. And in the year 1508, Alfonsina managed to arrange at Rome a marriage between Clarice, now 15, and Filippo Strozzi, the head of the most wealthy and important Florentine family next to the Medici. For thus daring to marry the daughter of a declared rebel and outlaw, Filippo Strozzi was summoned before the Signoria of Florence, heavily fined, and banished for 3 years. But the sentence was a half-hearted one, as we find him back in Florence in little more than a year afterwards. In 1509, as the result of the League of Cambrai, there took place the decisive battle of Agnadello, in which Venice received from the Allies a crushing blow from which she never recovered. Her power had been steadily declining since 1453, and was by this defeat completely broken. And as a consequence she lost Verona, Padua, Bergamo, Brescia, Cremona, and Piacenza, and became no longer of importance in European politics. In the same year Florence, after a long siege, recovered Pisa, which had been lost to her for 15 years. In this year Henry VII of England died, and was succeeded by his son Henry VIII, then 18. The latter in the same year married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and younger sister of Joanna of Spain. In 1510 Julius II changed sides and allied himself with Spain and Venice against the French, endeavoring to expel the latter from Italy. This brought him into collision with Ferrara in Florence. He first led a successful attack against Mirandola, and then advanced against Ferrara, but was defeated. Meanwhile, Louis XII retorted by proposing a council to depose the Pope, and demanded from his ally, Florence, that she should allow it to assemble at Pisa. Florence was placed in a dilemma. If she consented, she dreaded the Pope's enmity. If she refused, she would offend Louis XII and lose the protection of the French alliance. Soderini's government was quite incapable of dealing with such a problem, and by vacillation and endeavors to trim between the two opponents, contrived to offend both. Florence agreed to the assembly of the council at Pisa, but refused to permit a French force to enter Pisa to protect the council, and did not send Louis XII the troops she had promised. Julius II now determined to put an end to the inefficient government in Florence and to reinstate the Medici, and only waited until he should first have driven the French out of Italy, as by means of the Spanish alliance he hoped soon to do. In the meantime he appointed Giovanni his representative with the force of papal and Spanish troops which was then besieging Bologna. This period of the Interregnum, when war and its miseries raged over Italy, and confusion and anarchy were rampant in Florence, is nevertheless the time when art reached its culminating point. It was as though men, seeking an antidote to the violence and turmoil around them, turned to the pictures of the great masters of the time, which breathed an atmosphere of peace and rest not to be found elsewhere. The zenith of the art of the Renaissance falls between these years, 1494 and 1512, during which period The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, the frescoes on the roof of the Sixtine Chapel by Michelangelo, and the frescoes of the Camera della Segnatura by Raphael were painted, works in which art reached its highest development. There now succeeds a great army of painters, all of the first rank, and all practically contemporaneous, in whose hands art, so long associated almost entirely with Florence, soared forth over all Italy. To mention only the names of the chief of those who all flourished at this epoch is to call up before the mind's eye a mass of art creations such as no other period has produced. The following were all painting at this period, besides many others of less note: Botticelli, Florence; Leonardo da Vinci, Florence; Filippino Lippi, Florence; Lorenzo di Credi, Florence; Fra Bartolommeo, Florence; Michelangelo, Florence; Andrea del Sarto, Florence; Perugino, Perugia; Francia, Bologna; Pinturicchio, Perugia; Luini, Milan; Raphael, Urbino; Carpaccio, Venice; Giorgione, Venice; Titian, Venice; Palma Vecchio, Venice. In the year 1505 there were all working in Florence at one time Perugino, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Fra Bartolomeo, and Lorenzo di Credi. One may safely say that never on any other occasion were 6 such painters collected together at one time and place. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were at work on their cartoons for the great hall of the Palazzo della Signoria. Footnote: Michelangelo's statue of David had been finished the previous year. Perugino and Lorenzo di Credi were called upon to advise as to where it should be placed. End of footnote. Perugino was engaged on his Assumption in the church of the Annunziata, and Raphael was painting his Madonna del Granduca, Pitti, his Madonna del Cardellino, Uffizi, and his fresco of the Last Supper in the monastery of San Onofrio, which bears his signature and the date 1505. Botticelli was at this time 61, Perugino 59, Leonardo da Vinci 53, Michelangelo 30, and Raphael 22. Leonardo da Vinci was sent by Lorenzo the Magnificent to Il Moro as the best among the Florentine painters whom he could recommend to him in 1487. He remained with Il Moro for 12 years, during which time he founded the Milanese school of painting. He returned to Florence from 1503 to 1506, after which his principal home was Milan until 1516, when, at the earnest invitation of Francis I, who was anxious to inaugurate the patronage of art in France, he removed to that country and died there in 1519 at the age of 67. Raphael entered the school of Perugino at Perugia in the year 1500 at the age of 17. He came thence to Florence in 1504, being then 21, and painted there for 4 years. He was summoned by Pope Julius II to Rome in 1508, and worked there under that pope and his successor Leo X for the remaining 12 years of his life, dying at Rome in 1520 at the age of 37. Michelangelo, whose earliest impulses towards art had been fostered and directed by Lorenzo the Magnificent, whom throughout his life he never forgot, went to Rome for the first time in 1496. He worked there until 1500, when he returned to Florence, and remained there until 1506, when he was summoned by the Pope to Rome to design an immense tomb, larger and grander than that of any other pope, which Julius II desired to have constructed for himself. And in 1508 he was given the difficult task of painting the frescoes on the roof of the Sixtine Chapel. But to Michelangelo, grand as was his genius, has been traced the downfall of art, which about 2 decades later commenced, and which was fully developed long before his death in 1564. Ruskin, carefully tracing out the cause of this downfall, says that so long as artists employed their artistic powers to depict their subjects, art continued to advance. But as soon as they reversed this process and employed their subject to display their artistic powers, art's downfall began. And that this disastrous change was made by Michelangelo, who practiced the latter method throughout his life, whose unrivaled powers led all to follow him, and who, by adopting a principle alien to the true spirit of art, was the author of its downfall. It would seem that there was in Michelangelo a false idealism which was ready to distort to any extent the character of his subject in order to produce a result which would glorify his powers of execution. This first showed itself in his Bacchus, executed at Rome in 1496 and now in the Bargello Museum, which statue Shelley, while fully appreciating the great powers of execution that it displayed, declared to be a most revolting mistake of the whole spirit of Bacchus. It showed itself still more in his David, 1503, which, astonishing as it is in its execution, is false to the true spirit of art, in that, in order to display the powers of the sculptor, it falsifies the character of the subject, which might just as well be that of a young Samson or Hercules. The same thing is no less apparent in his Moses and in his statue of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. In each case, the subject is treated as of no importance and distorted out of all resemblance to its character in order to form a vehicle for the display of certain powers in the sculptor. There is not one of Michelangelo's statues in looking at which we are not forced by the artist to think not of the man depicted, but of Michelangelo. It is no wonder, therefore, in view of Michelangelo's long life and the leadership which his surpassing genius and the death of all the contemporaries of his earlier years gave to him, that Ruskin, after prolonged study of the subject, should have traced to him the downfall in art which, not long after Raphael's death, set in. And if anyone should desire to see how great that downfall was, he has but to walk in Florence from Or San Michele, which Donatello's statue of St. George adorns, to the Piazza San Lorenzo, where Baccio Bandinelli's hideous statue of Giovanni delle Bande Nere, executed in 1540, is an eyesore to the whole locality, or into the Piazza della Signoria, where the same artist's no less hideous statue of Hercules slaying Cacus, executed in 1534, disfigures the front of the Palazzo Vecchio. Before quitting the subject of art's zenith and downfall, the part which Pope Julius II played in connection with the former must not be omitted. For in the intervals of war, Julius II, following the Florentine school of thought in philosophy and religion, formulated a scheme which is set forth in the two final achievements attained by the art of painting, Michelangelo's frescoes on the roof of the Sixtine Chapel and Raphael's frescoes on the walls of the Camera della Segnatura, both works being in the Vatican and both executed for Julius II. These works, by two masters which differ so greatly, have yet underlying them a fundamental idea common to both, which, in view of the place and the circumstances, can only have been furnished by the Pope himself. The Florentine school of thought, under the leadership of Cosimo, Lorenzo, Ficino, and Pico della Mirandola, had endeavored to amalgamate Platonism and Christianity. Julius II, surrounded by men trained in that school, went a step further, and in the paintings which he caused to be executed by Michelangelo and Raphael in the Vatican, propounded that both the Jewish dispensation and the Greek philosophy were the antechambers through which the human race was shepherded to Christ. We see this idea first introduced in the frescoes on the roof of the Sixtine Chapel, wherein Michelangelo demonstrates it by showing the human race led to Christ through a long line of pagan sibyls and Jewish prophets. And we see the same idea elaborated with a still greater wealth of thought in Raphael's frescoes round the Pope's principal official room, the Camera della Segnatura, the first work executed by Raphael on reaching Rome in 1508, frescoes of which the general scheme must have been supplied by the Pope, though the wonderful way in which it is worked out is Raphael's own great achievement. In the four world-renowned pictures which covered the four walls of this room, Raphael, on the text given him by the Pope, preaches his great sermon. And in pictures in which the celebrated scientists, philosophers, and poets of pre-Christian times peer together with those of the Christian epoch, teaches the lesson that the human soul is to aspire towards God in each of its faculties. In the exercise of reason and scientific research, the School of Athens; in the exercise of the artistic and aesthetic faculty, Parnassus; in the exercise of the faculty of order and good government, secular and ecclesiastical laws; and lastly, in the exercise of the more definitely religious faculty, theology, the science about God. In these pictures, therefore, two lessons are combined. First, that the pre-Christian philosophers and scientists showed in their degree aspirations towards God, and helped to prepare the human race for Christianity. And second, that in man's aspirations towards God, his highest intellectual faculties are not to be excluded, but that all his faculties are to be included and consecrated to God. The thoughts thus expressed show the standpoint which had at length been reached after nearly 80 years' discussion of these subjects by the thinkers of Florence. We are reminded of Pico della Mirandola's speech long before: "Philosophy seeks truth, theology finds it, religion possesses it." How much of the sermon belongs to Julius II, and how much to the great artist Raphael, we can never know. But we could have no grander example of the way in which art is a language and has deep thoughts to speak to all who will listen to its words. But there was one event at this time in the world of art, inseparably connected with Pope Julius II, which by no means redounded to his glory or that of any of those concerned in it. Urged on by Bramante and Michelangelo, he committed the enormous vandalism of pulling down the old St. Peter's, rich with 1,000 years' historical associations, because it would not hold the huge and tasteless tomb which he had ordered, and erecting instead the present St. Peter's. Regarding this act and the motives which caused it, Ranke remarks as follows: "Was it not profoundly significant that a pope should himself resolve to demolish the ancient basilica of St. Peter's, the great metropolitan church, every part of which was hallowed, every portion crowded with monuments that had received the veneration of ages, and determined to erect a temple planned after those of antiquity on its site? Both the factions then dividing the jealous world of art urged Julius II to this enterprise. Michelangelo desired a fitting receptacle for the enormous monument of the Pope, which he proposed to complete on a vast scale, and with that lofty grandeur which he had exhibited in his Moses. Yet more pressing was Bramante, whose ambition it was to execute that bold project of raising high in the air, on colossal pillars, an exact copy of the Pantheon in all the majesty of its proportions. Many cardinals remonstrated, and it would even appear that there was a general opposition to the plan. So much of personal affection attaches itself to every old church, how much more than to this, the chief sanctuary of Christendom? As Panvivius wrote, "He had men of almost all classes against him, and especially the cardinals, not because they did not wish to have a new basilica erected with all possible magnificence, but because they grieved that the old one should be pulled down, revered as it was by the whole world, ennobled by the sepulchres of so many saints, and illustrious for so many great things that had been done in it." But Julius was not accustomed to regard contradictions. Without further consideration, he caused one half of the old church to be demolished, and himself laid the foundation stone of the new one. The year 1512 opened with a new series of military operations. France, Ferrara, and Florence on one side were against the Pope, Spain, and Venice on the other. The French army was commanded by the brave and capable young general Gaston de Foix, cousin of Louis XII and only 24 years of age. The Spanish forces were commanded by Raimondo de Cardona, Viceroy of Naples, and the papal troops were placed by Julius II under Cardinal Giovanni de Medici. And as to rise in favor with Julius II, one had to be above all things a soldier. Giovanni could not refuse, though he evidently had no talents in that direction. After several brilliant successes had been gained by the French under the leadership of Gaston de Foix, a pitched battle was fought on the 6th April, 1512, at Ravenna, in which the papal and Spanish army was totally defeated by the French, who, however, sustained a serious loss, for at the moment of victory their brave young commander, Gaston de Foix, was killed. This battle was one of the bloodiest on record, and while the commander on the French side was killed, Cardinal Giovanni, the Pope's representative, was taken prisoner by the French and sent a captive to Milan. Pope Julius II was not cowed by this reverse. He rapidly collected a fresh army. The loss of Gaston de Foix seemed to paralyze the French. The tide of victory turned, and within 3 months the French army was driven across the Alps. Then Julius II turned his arms against Florence, and the troops of the Holy League which he had formed were sent against her, Julius II being determined to put an end to the existing state of things in that city, and to visit Soderini in particular with a wrath for having allowed the assembly of the council at Pisa. Cardona's army of Spanish troops was therefore ordered to advance into Tuscany, and Cardinal Giovanni having escaped from Milan, he, his brother, and his cousin were sent with it, the Pope informing Florence that the terms he required from her was that she should dismiss the gonfaloniere Soderini, pay a fine of 100,000 florins, and allow the Medici to return to Florence. These terms Soderini's government declined to accept, and sent an inefficient force, chiefly composed of Machiavelli's newly organized militia, to oppose Cardona's army at Prato, about 10 miles from Florence. Cardona reached Prato on the 28th August, and summoned it to surrender, which being refused, the attack was at once commenced, and after a feeble resistance, the town was taken by assault on the 29th August. The terrible sack of Prato, which has become proverbial among such events on account of the atrocities committed by the inhuman Spanish troops, ensued. Mr. Hyatt says, "The horrors of the sack which followed are without a parallel in history. For 21 days no attempt seems to have been made by Cardona to control his savage, greedy, and licentious soldiery. Every building was pillaged. The defenseless inhabitants were chased from street to street and slaughtered as soon as overtaken. Neither youth, age, nor sex, neither the sanctity of place nor office were respected. Mothers threw their daughters into wells and jumped in after them. Men cut their own throats, and girls flung themselves from balconies onto the paving stones below to escape from violence and dishonor. It is said that 5,600 Pratans perished." A medieval army was on such occasions absolutely uncontrollable, and it is a mistake to speak of Cardona as though he wielded a power over his troops of a kind similar to that possessed by a modern commander and failed to exercise it. Discipline, as we understand it, scarcely existed in such army at any time, and in the sack of a city not a vestige of it remained. From the moment that a town was taken by assault, there was no longer an army, but only a horde of savage ruffians with arms in their hands, mad with passion, and ready in a moment to turn their weapons against those who for the time were but nominal commanders, should these latter attempt to interfere with their proceedings. The real cruelty was perpetrated by the weak and incapable governing body headed by Soderini in sending a totally insufficient force to Prato, not strong enough to meet Cardona's army with any chance of success, but just sufficient to make the result upon Prato which actually occurred a certainty, and this in the case of a town which had no voice in the matter of offering resistance to that army. The Medici brothers were not present during the whole of these terrible doings at Prato. Giuliano was only there during the first 2 days, Giovanni for 10 days longer. During this time they exerted themselves to do what they could to protect the women and children, among other things getting a guard placed over the great church in which a large number of them had taken refuge. And Jovius states that if the Cardinal de Medici and his brother Giuliano had not at the risk of their lives opposed themselves to the fury of the conquerors, these enormities would have been carried to a still greater excess. While these horrors were taking place at Prato, Florence was occupied in carrying out a rapid revolution. Immediately on the news being received that Prato had been taken and that these atrocities were being perpetrated there, a number of the citizens, justly attributing all that had occurred to Soderini's mismanagement, forced their way into his room, made him resign his office, and sent him under an escort to Siena, whence he fled to Castelnuovo, where, that town being under the Turks, he felt safe from Julius II, whose personal animosity against him for the matter of the council he well knew. The remaining members of the government hastily signified to Cardona their willingness to allow the Medici to return, and agreed to pay the fine which the Pope demanded. And on the 1st September 1512, the Medici once more entered Florence after an exile of 18 years. Moreover, it was soon evident that the people were glad to get them back again, that it had only been the power of a dominant faction which had kept them out so long, and that the result of the misrule suffered under the government of the latter had sunk deep into the minds of the people. For had it been otherwise, the re-establishment of the family in Florence would not have been accompanied by the results which ensued. That they were greeted on their arrival with the old shouts of "Palle, palle," may not of itself show much. More significant, however, is the fact that the Spanish troops which had escorted them into the city were able within a month to be entirely dispensed with, and this notwithstanding that all laws passed since 1494 were repealed, that the Consiglio Maggiore established by Savonarola was abolished, and that the government was remodeled on exactly the same lines as in the times of Lorenzo the Magnificent, although a law expressly forbidding this had been passed in 1495. There was no demonstration whatever against these changes, and Professor Villari tells us that after the Spaniards had left, the new government required no support from foreign troops. Also, the writings and conduct of Francesco Valori, Nerli, and Machiavelli fully corroborate the statement made by the latter that even those who disapproved of the present constitutional changes soon reconciled themselves to the return of the old order of things. From the above it is clear that although the Medici returned in accordance with the terms imposed upon the city by Julius II, yet the people were well content to have it so. They were in fact sick to death of the misgovernment they had experienced for so many years, and ready to welcome a rule which had ever been associated with order and security to life and property. And the conduct of the Medici brothers, Giovanni and Giuliano, was worthy of the occasion. They followed the traditions of their house, and the example that had been set by Cosimo Pater Patria and Piero il Gottoso. Their family had been made to suffer much. They themselves had had to endure for long years the harsh conditions attaching to the life of outcasts and wanderers. They returned to a family home which had been swept bare, all the invaluable collections of their ancestors which it had contained when they left it having been wantonly destroyed or carried off. Nevertheless, their father Lorenzo's speech of 46 years before was not forgotten by his sons, and they showed that they knew how to conquer by showing that they knew how to forgive. The vindictive policy which among the Florentines invariably accompanied the return to power of a banished faction was by the Medici entirely rejected. There were no executions, prohibitions, confiscations, or banishments, except in the case of Piero Soderini, who had been banished by the Florentines themselves before the Medici returned, and even he was afterwards befriended by Giovanni. In this manner did the Medici once more set up their rule in Florence, and all things seemed to augur well for its satisfactory continuance, especially as it was decided that the rule should be placed in the hands of Giuliano, both Giovanni and Giulio being anxious to depart to Rome, where the election of a new pope was imminent.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.